It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Wilson. She was or is instrumental in bringing these three scholars to the library for this series of presentations on Ezra Pound. She's really the mover and shaker behind all that, and just like to thank her and invite her to come up and share a few words with you.
Thank you, Kristen. I first want to thank the library. Without Lynn and Kristen, this wouldn't be happening. And this is, I think you all know, this is the third of a three-part lecture series. Each lecture has been totally different. And now for something more interesting. Not one person in 1,000 likes him, and a great many people detest him because he is so darned full of himself. Here's another one. He's always hurting people's feelings. These were his friends who said this. With friends like this, right? That was Yeats and William Carlos Williams. But this is a very difficult guy. And I so appreciate your interest in learning more about why he's so complicated. I have to add, these buttons are available free of charge. It's his motto, make it new. Please grab one. I also posted some of his early poems, and if you see something you like, just pull it off and take it with you. There's also tonight, special, the autobiography of Ezra Pound's dad, who was raised in Wisconsin, free of charge. Just take it with you if you're interested. And with that, am I forgetting anything? No. I'm going to give it back to Kristen for the official introduction of John.
Thank you, Jennifer. So like Jennifer said, this is the third of a three-part series. The first talk really looked deeply at Mussolini and Mussolini's fascism. Last night we looked at Canto 45, thank you. So each talk really presents a different facet of Ezra Pound. And tonight we have Dr. John Gery presenting From Idleness to Splendor, Ezra Pound's Poetic Legacy. Dr. Gery is a Fulbright scholar and currently works as a research professor at the University of New Orleans. He has served as the secretary of the Ezra Pound International Conference for over 20 years. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Gery.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. It's very nice to see you. I hope you can hear my voice okay. It's a great honor, a real honor for me to be here with you tonight, and I know it's the third night for some of you, and so I especially appreciate those steadfast ones who've decided they would go one more night, even though it's this guy's talking. It's a rare opportunity for me to have this chance to speak with you, and I thank you especially. But I also want to thank Kristen and the library and the town center for this opportunity. Thank you very much for much more than just the technical and the arrangements of all that kind of work that goes into it, but also for your cordial hospitality. It's very meaningful to me. Also, I wanted to thank Jennifer Wells Green and Courtney Gilbert at the Ezra Pound McCurber House, which we visited yesterday. And they met with us, and we had some very good conversation about the past, the present, and the future of that house and its place in Haley and its place in literary history. And so there's a lot more conversation to take place, but I much appreciated their taking the time to meet with Bob von Hallberg and Jennifer Wilson and me yesterday afternoon. Also want to thank Florence Blanchard for all the work that she's done on behalf of Pound. We were at the Historical Society Museum today to see the Pound exhibit that's there, and it's been there a long time. It's a very interesting thing for someone to see like me, and I know that she was instrumental in that process of getting that there. I need to thank Darlene Dyer for her efforts on behalf of Pound and me and many of us. I'm going to start crying, I haven't even started. And also for her husband, Ted Dyer. I don't know if I get to thank Darlene for that, but he has not only played an instrumental role in Pound, and especially in the successful Ezra Pound conference that took place at Sun Valley and in Haley in 2003, which was the last time that I was here, and doing that 20 years ago, but he's been doing things on behalf of Pound ever since, including this week on Monday or Tuesday when he spoke. So thanks to Ted, and thanks to Robert von Hallberg, who I have known about 50 years, and who was my teacher. He's been my friend for the better part of the 50 years, but he was my teacher first. So if I'm nervous, it's probably mostly because of him, because I'm still trying to get that grade. I'm not sure I'm going to ever get it, but I've been trying for a long time. And especially I have to thank Jennifer Wilson, who you just saw and whom you all know. She's been kind of a visionary in relation to the subject that matters so much to me and to Ted and to Bob and to so many people I know all over the world. She's transformative with the way that she has attended to the legacy of Ezra Pound, and much of that is still in front of us, and she will continue to play that role. So I can't thank her enough, not only for the hospitality of this week, but for what she's been doing for years, and for how much we all owe to her in my world, the world of poetry and the world of Pound. That said, I have a number of things I'd like to talk about tonight, and I think I'm following suit with Ted and Bob in that I have more to say than I have time to say it. So I will do what I can to keep it interesting. I can't do that 2-minute History of America thing that you've probably seen, where they give you the history of America in 2 minutes. I have a little more time than that, and I don't have to go through all of America, so that helps. But I thought Ted on Tuesday really impressed upon us well that the Italian fascism is not the same thing as Nazism, not the same thing as German fascism, that it is a very particular ideology from a particular point in history, and that it had a particular crossroads with the native son of Haley, Ezra Pound, who found himself in Italy in the 1920s. And so I appreciated a lot of what Ted had to say about that to give us an important context. I also appreciate it in the same way that I appreciate Bob von Hallberg, because you guys did the dirty work, and I get to have the fun. And so I appreciate they're willing to come and dig the ditches and make the trenches, and then I get to come in and talk about the poetry, because that's what I came here to do. I much appreciate that. Not that I'm afraid, the opposite. I think it's very constructive discussions that we've had after the first 2 sessions. And the more of that we can hear, that I can hear from those of you who are here, the more exciting it becomes for me. It's not something to be shy about, because the only way we can face the truth of history is by bringing everything in. And that was a big discussion last night. I also appreciated from Bob's talk, especially in relation to Haley, how he talked about the idea of Haley in the work of Ezra Pound. Not just the fact that Ezra Pound was born here and was baptized here and then left before he was 2 years old, but the fact that that fact had such a resonant impact on him throughout the rest of his life. And that's really an interesting idea that I hadn't thought about. I mean, we can all think about that, where I think about what I know about my family history, places that I've never been, that I'm from, and how much that plays into my imagination. And that's a real, it's not something, people talk about the Haley connection, Pound talks about it, but it's kind of, we have to look for it. And you pointed us into some really good directions for that. So I really appreciate that. What I'd like to do is first quote from one of Pound's most interesting books in prose called The ABC of Reading, which is, he wrote as a kind of textbook. It's often not thought of as a textbook, but it actually is a great textbook. And when one of the first things when people say, what's this legacy about Pound? Why is he so important? And say, because no poet in the 20th century can really think about writing poetry without having come to terms in some way with Ezra Pound. One of those is evident in the ABC of Reading. I can teach the ABC of Reading in a beginning creative writing class in poetry. I'm a poet, and it doesn't matter that it was published in 1934. The questions that it raises, the students go, I got to think about that. So even if they don't want to read as poetry, if they read that book, it not only can, it does start to shape and influence their thinking, even if they disagree with it. You know, you have a good teacher who says something that provokes you, but you keep thinking about it and have to come to terms with it. That's what Pound does. What he says in that book, the only thing I want to quote for here, is he says, approach. It doesn't, in our contemporary world, so much matter where you begin the examination of a subject, as long as you keep on until you get round to your starting point. And I always have trouble starting with Pound. Like, where do you begin? You don't have to begin at the beginning. He says you can get anywhere. But I love this expression, until you get round to your starting point. That's the Haley connection to me. I don't know anybody in Europe, in England, who would ever say, till you get round to where you started from. You know, they got to be getting round from someplace to get back to that spot. I'm hoping to get round from idleness, which is something I love that evades my life, and to splendor, which is what I think we're all kind of looking for. That said, instead of beginning where I thought I was, in the beginning, I'm going to begin in the middle. You have a handout. The handout is not, well, I can give you a quiz about it tomorrow if you want, but I don't suspect that many people will be here then. Most of the poems I have on the screen are also in the handout, but the handout is also for you to take as a little bit. I'm not going to make you read through all of that, or as much as I'd love to, I'm not going to do that. But I am going to start with Canto 1, which is, I think, on the 3rd page of the handout, where it says cantos at the top, because it's a proof of what Pound says in ABC of Reading, even though he wrote this poem initially about 20 years, almost 20 years before he wrote those words I just read to you. He was trying to write a poem of no known length, a poem concerning history, an epic poem that is in the tradition of epic poems but is not like epic poems. And one of the first things to know about Pound is that he's trying to make it new, to innovate the idea of what an epic means in the modern world. We don't live in a world, except in places in the world they do, for example in Turkey, where you have actually bards who make a living going from town to town reciting the epic poems of the ancient past from memory. That's the way that Homer would have done it, or people in Homer's time. But most of us don't do that. We don't memorize the poems. And so Pound is trying to deal with the fact that what does the place of an epic poem in the modern world? Part of that world, or the modernist world, is one that he's deeply involved with and shaping. So he decides, after 3 drafts of different things, that his epic poem, which is going to be called the Cantos, begins with Canto 1 and begins with the word and. It starts in the middle. And what does it start with? If you know Dante's Divine Comedy, people have been mentioning it, the first line in Dante's Divine Comedy is, I don't know most of the other lines, but I know that line. I found myself in the middle of a wood. That's how Dante begins. I found myself in the middle of a wood, the middle of a dark wood. So he's suddenly in the middle of nowhere, and he finds out that he's in the Inferno. And he has a guide. His guide is the poet Virgil. Every poet needs a guide. All of us need a guide. Pound begins not with Dante. He thinks of Dante. He thinks of Virgil, but he's actually beginning with Homer. Only he's not beginning with the beginning of Homer's great epic, the Odyssey. He's beginning in the middle, in Book 11 of the Odyssey, where it is taking place where Odysseus, who has been living on the island of Circe for 2 years, filled with adventures, is now leaving because he needs to leave to go back to his home in Ithaca. In order to do that, Circe, the goddess, tells him he has to first go to the underworld and meet this guy Tiresias, the blind prophet, who will give him the directions he needs to go back home. That's how he's going to find his directions. So he takes his men, after they had been transformed into swine and then transformed back in all these stories, and they get on this ship, leaving the island of Circe, headed to the underworld. This is where Pound begins the cantos, with the word and. I'll just read these lines. You have them also on your handout. I can find them. This is like cinematic, I think, the description of the ship, of the men on the ship. Where are they headed? They're headed to hell. And then went down to the ship, set keel to breakers forth on the godly sea, and we set up masts and sail on that swart ship, bore sheep aboard her, and our bodies also heavy with weeping. So winds from sternward bore us out onward with bellying canvas. Circe's this craft, the trim coiffed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus with stretched sail we went over sea till day's end, sun to his slumber, shadows o'er all the ocean. Came we then to the bounds of deepest water, to the Cimmerian lands and peopled cities covered with close-webbed mist, unpierced over with glitter of sun rays, nor with stars stretched, nor looking back from heaven. Swartest night stretched over wretched men there, the ocean flowing backward. Came we then to the place aforesaid by Circe. Can you see the imagery here? This is like they're going in to the edge of the earth where they're going down in the ship. And the key line here is the sea, the ocean flowing backward. The ship is going in the direction of the underworld. The sea is actually flowing in the opposite direction in which their ship is going. And he uses phrases like sun to his slumber, sun to his slumber. Now, I think if you go to Homer to this passage, you're not going to find that passage there in the Greek or in the translation. Actually, Pound is basing this poem on a translation, not on the Greek of Homer, but he's basing it on a Latin translation of the Greek that he happened to come across in Paris in a bookstall that was dated from the 16th century. So he's talking about three different texts at the same time. The ancient classical text, the 16th century book he found in Latin, in a different language, and the English. Only he's not done there because the language sun to his slumber is what we call a kenning, which is what was developed in the Middle Ages by the Anglo-Saxon poets, where they're saying, how do you describe the sunset? You don't say sunset, twilight. You say sun to his slumber. sun's going to sleep. Personifying the sun is the more vivid way to portray what happens in the evening. If I go on too long, the sun will go to his slumber, and then you'll be sorry, we'll all fall asleep, right? But that's the kind of, where does Pound get that? He gets that from a completely different source. I mean, Bob talked about this yesterday. He brings these things from all these different sources. This is a medieval poem. So the medievalists are probably going to be offended. How can he use medieval language in a poem that's in Greek? The Greek scholars, they're offended. He's not following Homer at all, right? The Latin scholars are saying, well, Andrea Stivas, who did this Latin, we've outdated him. That was 500 years ago, right? And the modern poet are saying, how come you're not using modern English to talk about stuff? Nobody's going to be happy, but in fact, all of it starts to work together if we start to see what he's doing. I think this image of the sea flowing backwards, it gets worse, but I'm not going to take you there now. It gets worse. They get into the underworld, and it's amazing what happens. They're feeding those sheep like something out of Night of the Living Dead to the dead who are coming toward them, who want their, what does he call it? Blood. Yeah, they want the blood, and it's called the fine or something. They want their donation before they're going to talk to him, because he's looking for Tiresias, who's behind all these dead people, who are dead soldiers, dead mothers. He sees his own mother there. He didn't know she'd died since he'd gone to the Trojan War. He finds her there in hell. That comes from Odysseus. So here we are in the middle. Where does this come from? All these different things. Well, we know it comes from Haley, Idaho, right? Actually, we can start and say it comes from Chippewa Falls. Jennifer's offering the book of the writings of Homer Pound, Ezra Pound's father. This is Ezra Pound's grandfather, who is a fascinating figure, Thaddeus Coleman Pound, who was a lumber manufacturer or lumberman working in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and raised his family there. You can see he became a member of the state assembly, then he became lieutenant governor of the state in 1871. And then he ran for the U.S. Congress, and he served in the U.S. Congress from 1876, that's my mistake. I'm very amateur, forgive me about that. 1876 to 1884. This is Pound's grandfather he's like a pioneer in Wisconsin in the middle of the 19th century. Thaddeus Coleman, as an entrepreneur, also ran the general store. So there's a kind of, he was like Mr. Chippewa Falls. He had the main business. Most of the people worked for him. When they got paid on Friday, they went to the general store, bought all the things that they need. All that money went back to him. He went and bought more things for them. They went back to work the next week. So he was really running the economy of this whole town. This factors into Pound's way of thinking about how economics can work when it has to do with, as Bob talked about, usury, the use of economics, the use of finances. There's one line in the cantos about Thaddeus Coleman Pound, and that man sweated blood to put through that railway. In the middle of a canto 21, he has this one line that refers to Thaddeus Coleman. That's part of Pound's style, which we'll talk a little bit more about here. His son, Homer Loomis Pound, then was assigned the job of coming to Haley to work as, and Jennifer knows a lot more about this than I do, but as an assayer, right? He came to keep the record books for the lumbering and the mining industry that was going on here at that time, in the mid-1880s. I'm not sure when they arrived. When he came here, he had recently married Isabel Weston Pound. She was not from Chippewa Falls. She was from Manhattan, New York, a place you might have heard of. Very different kind of background, very different kind of family, dating back. They had some respectable people in the Weston family, and they had some not so respectable people, such as horse thieves in his lineage on that side. Pound is actually, like many Americans, has all these mixed forces working in his background. But they came to Idaho, and in Haley, and you know they were here for only a short time, but Ezra Pound was conceived here, and he was born here, and he lived here for about 15 or 16 months before probably making Isabel sort of happy, leaving and going back to East. They ended up going to Philadelphia. When they got to Philadelphia, they first lived in a small house, and Homer went to work for the U.S. Mint building, which is renovated, but it's still there where he worked. And he was a kind of clerk in the middle class, upwardly mobile. They lived on a small row house in central Philadelphia. But then when he could afford it, he bought a bigger house in a suburban area called Wyncote. And Wyncote at the time was a brand new suburb, no trees, just they cleared the trees away and they were putting some big houses up out there. And the Pound family moved out there, and that's really where Pound had his childhood until he went to college, although he went to college at about the age of 16. And at first he went to a kindergarten that was very close to their house, and then he went to this military academy called Cheltenham Military Academy. He never finished at Cheltenham because he went to college. He got into the University of Pennsylvania before he got his degree, so he didn't really need to get his degree, which is not that unusual, but at the age of 16, he was ready to go to college. Just a few lines from this letter that he wrote in 1899, so he's like a young teenager, about Cheltenham. He says, "I'm going over to dance tonight and expect a good time. Things are going a little better here, as I only got 2 demerits last week." This is telling us a little bit about the young Ezra. "I recited the Bivouac of the Dead this afternoon and got pretty fair mark, I think. I've tried to write a composition and have included it here, enclosed in the first copy. I thought perhaps you would like to see it. Do not publish it, nor read it to anyone." I here quote Pa's last letter. "Mind now. Tell Pa that I received the cash he sent and was duly thankful. I have since found my purse." So here's the son at school writing a letter to his mother and telling her that he only got 2 demerits last week, so she should be proud of him. Pound was big on playing chess. He was interested in sports and so on, but chess was especially interesting to him when he was a young man. From Cheltenham, he went to, I want to tell this story first too. This is Hilda Doolittle. Hilda Doolittle is originally born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is a Moravian community, and she's actually buried in Bethlehem in a Moravian cemetery, which is another whole interesting story about how Moravians do their rituals, which I won't go into now. But Hilda's a year younger than Ezra, and he met her at a dance when they were still in their mid-teens, and they developed an affection for each other. Hilda was the youngest of 7 children. Her father was an astronomer who was working in Bethlehem, but he got a job at the University of Pennsylvania, so he came to Philadelphia. They lived in a different suburb from where Pound lived, so they lived a train ride away from each other. It was not next door. But she was the youngest of 7 children, but the only girl. So she was surrounded by brothers growing up, and she is a fascinating poet. She's an amazing figure in the 20th century in her own right. Well, this is a picture of her, maybe about how, the one in the middle, about how she looked when she first knew Ezra when they were young teenagers. She became kind of infatuated with him. He would visit her. He would recite poetry to her. He called her names that were Greek kind of names from his studies in the classics. There are memories of him climbing in a tree and talking to her in very arduous language, the language of love. She writes novels that were never published during her lifetime about this early time, and they're fascinating to read because they're very impressionistic. You have to and they're all made up fiction names, but you know she's talking about Ezra. And for example, Ezra is staying too long. He's going to miss the last train before he goes home. Her father, of course, is not approving of her beau because he's not looking like he's going to do very much in his life. He's dressing oddly. He has red hair. He's tall and thin. She's also very tall, which is one of the advantages that he had with her because she was taller than many of the other boys her age. But they developed a connection there that never ended. And Bob talked about that. They're very different poets, very different kinds of characters, but they had a big influence on each other. If we talk about the concerns about Ezra Pound and his sensibility, one of them a main thing has to do with how his relationships went with women throughout his life. It's something, a very interesting dimension of him. I don't think it's something that needs to be defended any more than anybody else in their personal relationships, but it's filled with lots of nuances that make him a very intriguing figure, the way that women are both drawn to him and at the same time, many times, resistant to him because of his strong personality. Again, Bob referred to that. He's attracted to beautiful women and attracted to powerful men. And they had a similar kind of response to him when they encountered him. Often against him, often toward him. At the same time, often. None of us have ever had any relationships like that. All ours are perfectly calm, and we have no tempestuous. This book is her first collection from 1916 called Sea Garden, and I'll come back to that if I have a chance. Here's Ezra Pound in 1905. He actually went to the University of Pennsylvania as a freshman in 1902. Bob referred to his first trip to Europe when he was 13. He also went in 1902 in the summer with his Aunt Frank again and with his parents, if I remember. So he'd been to Europe twice by the time he was about 17 years old. He was a freshman at Penn. Picture of Penn. This is a picture of the dormitory on the right lower corner where he lived when he first went there. And here I'll take a little issue with Jennifer in a way that I think is really interesting. That is the two quotations that you read. The one from William Carlos Williams is, what does he say? That's not the one that says nobody likes him. It's the one that...
One by Yeats says he's always hurting people's feelings.
Oh, that's Yeats. So the other one is nobody likes him. Right. And this comes from when they were at Penn together. Pound was at Penn. He was 16 years old. There was another student there by the name of William Carlos Williams who came from New Jersey. This is William Carlos Williams. Williams his mother was from Puerto Rico. He's from a kind of a mixed ethnic background. He came to the University of Pennsylvania, which at the time had probably the best reputation for medical studies in the United States at the turn of the century. And Williams, coming from a modest family, came to Penn to study dentistry. And a year later, this young whippersnapper guy comes in, named Ezra Pound, who came to study comparative literature. Williams wanted to study literature, but he felt he needed to study medicine because that means he could get a job. He actually switched from dentistry to medicine, which was a good idea, and he became a great pediatrician through the rest of his life. I have a friend who was wife was delivered by William Carlos Williams, you know. It was like that's a sort of an interesting distinction. But they were in that same dormitory together, and someone introduced them because they were both musicians. And Williams met Pound, who was this dramatic would-be poet. And Williams didn't like that, but he also, of course, loved it. He found a true and fast friend. But when he wrote about him, it's like, nobody likes this guy because he's weird. He was definitely weird. He wore funny-looking socks. There's a story about them throwing him into a pond because they didn't like the way he was dressed at Penn. It wasn't a military school, so he didn't have to go through hazing in that way. Bob said he was like a professor's favorite student. Not really. They actually didn't like him because he was too much trouble. He raised too many questions, and he studied what they asked him to study, and then he didn't agree with what they said. And he actually became very antagonistic to universities and said, they just teach you what they want to teach you, and they don't want to think about it. And he wanted someone to challenge him, which is partly why he ended up transferring to Hamilton College and getting his degree. But then, after he finished Hamilton College, which he finished early because he took all the courses they had in comparative literature they could find, Spanish, French, Italian, and some classics. He finished there, he came back to Philadelphia, and he enrolled in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where he encountered some of the same professors he'd had before, and they were not particularly happy that he was coming back. But a couple of them appreciated him. So this is the college sort of time. When he was in college, he also performed in this performance of Iphigenia in Taurus by Euripides, by Euripides, the Greek playwright. He didn't have a main role in it, he was just part of the member of the chorus. But there are a few photographs of them, and here's Pound like dancing as a sort of in drag in 1903, I think this was. And this has been blown up from a larger photograph. This poem I'll read. When Pound was involved with Hilda and would visit her, and he would recite these poems, he was writing poems for her. Very romantic, but classic, and very kind of antiquated kind of voice. But he was the young teenage poet who wanted to be with the gods. One of the poems he wrote was this one, and this is really the best poem in that group. He made a book for her called Hilda's Book, which he wrote out all the poems on fancy paper and hand-stitched them together into a special edition and presented to her called Hilda's Book. And this book is now obviously of great interest to a lot of scholars. Some of the other work like he did at that time is not, people can't find it, and they're interested to find it. So I'll read you this poem called The Tree. I hope I'm doing okay on time, because I'm losing my concept of time. But we should read this poem. This is the first one on the first page, if you can't read it here. It doesn't really address Hilda, but it's part of that time when he was with her. I stood still and was a tree amid the wood, knowing the truth of things unseen before, of Daphne and the laurel bough, and that God-feasting couple old that grew elm oak amid the wold. 'Twas not until the gods had been kindly entreated and been brought within unto the hearth of their heart's home that they might do this wonder thing. Ne'ertheless, I have been a tree amid the wood, and many a new thing understood that was rank folly to my head before. This is really quite a remarkable poem for someone so young to have written when we start to look at it. It's very carefully constructed. It's very precise in its language. I think it's immediately accessible to us. It has such music as the rhyme scheme, you know, wood and old and wold and before, with within, been and within, and then the wood and stood and before. He uses the first line, I stood still and was a tree amid the wood, and then he frames the poem at the end, nevertheless I have been a tree amid the wood. So he cuts the poem between the same line that echoes. It becomes a kind of a rhyming line. And we could scan it, we could spend an hour talking about the various things going on artfully in this poem. But what I just wanted to point out is how he makes two allusions to the Greeks, right sort of casually. Daphne, you may know the story of Daphne, the one who was being chased by Apollo, the god of the sun and music, because he's pursuing her, the young virgin Daphne, because he wants to take her in his arms. And she flees from him and she screams to her father, "Save me from this God who's pursuing me." And the I'm trying to remember which goddess comes to her aid and transforms her into a tree. So she starts to grow roots, and by the time he reaches her, he's clasping to a tree instead of clasping to Daphne. So she gets, this is from Ovid's Metamorphosis, is where the story is told, beautiful story told, about how Daphne, in her sadness and eagerness and everything else, in a very kind of racy scene, avoids the assault of Apollo by being transformed into a tree. This is one transformation. The other one is actually a very different kind of transformation, but also involving trees. And that's the god-feasting couple Old. This is also from Ovid. It's the story of Baucis and Philemon, the old couple, poor couple, who live in the woods by themselves, modestly. And Zeus, the god, decides he's going to go to Earth dressed as an impoverished old man to see how he's treated. And everywhere he goes, he's kicked, he's spat on, he's thrown out, he's knocked around, and he finally comes to this, by rich people, poor people, he finally comes to the modest little house in the woods of Baucis and Philemon. And he says, "Can you help me?" And they immediately take him in, and they immediately feed him. They give him everything they have so that he can be comfortable. And they have no idea who he is. He's just a man. As their reward for their behavior toward him, he tells them, "I will do anything for you in the world that you want." And they said, "What we would like is when we die, to die together and to be together always." So he arranges it when they die that they become an elm tree and an oak tree, and that they are enwrapped with each other and growing forever. So these are two tales about transformation, metamorphosis from being human to being a tree. And the poet says, "I stood still and was a tree amid the wood." He's writing a poem about turning into a tree. Turning into a tree. And what that means. And that means, it can mean all kinds of things. It can mean all kinds of things. Among other things, for Pound, this is a poem he keeps. And when he does his own selected poems, this is from 1908. When he does this first edition of this, which is not the first persona, which he did that Bob referred to, but when he does it as his selected shorter poems in the 1920s, 1926 I think it is, the first poem he puts in the book is this poem. And it's not the first poem he wrote, and it's not even the first poem in Hilda's book, but it's a poem that tells us what the rest of the book is going to do, which is going to be about the poet becoming different things throughout the book. That's the persona. He takes on the role of all kinds of different people in different languages from history. But first he says, "I stood still and became something else." It's almost like a punchline or a motto for a poet. What does a poet do? A poet becomes something else and then writes the poem from that perspective. And that's what Pound is telling us, among other things, in this first poem. What does it mean not to be ourselves, and how does that transform who we are? And he says at the end, "I have been a tree amid the wood, and many a new thing understood that was rank folly to my head before." And he's preparing for us to read these poems that come after this and be prepared for the rank folly in our head to become something we understand. And I think this is partly what we're doing this week, is to understand what seems rank folly can mean something else. This is not to dismiss it, not to belittle it, but to understand it, to understand what it means by getting a little bit outside of that which we think we are and allowing ourselves to be changed by it. Okay, so there's that. Then he goes to Crawfordsville. We've had both of the speakers have talked about this. They both gave interestingly different stories about what happened to Pound and how he got kicked out. And I have yet a different one, but I'm not going to tell that story. The follow-up is that about 10 years ago, they found a letter from the college that the president sent to Pound in January after he was kicked out in December to say, please come back. And he didn't. He obviously didn't go back. But there was a sense in which the president, according to my source, Emily Wallace, is like, the president said, we made a mistake. We should have let him stay here. But you can imagine this figure who likes to stand in trees and recite poems going to this small conservative town in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And of course, if there's a carnival coming through and somebody has no place to stay, it's no skin off his nose or whatever to have the person have a place to stay so she's not out in the cold. But he's in a rooming house where the two women running the rooming house don't like this, and so they call the college, and sure enough, he gets in trouble. But the story I want to tell, if I can, I'll try to keep it really short, but it's, to me, typical of an epic poet who's trying to write a poem all about everything for everyone. And that's not that it's huge and inclusive, but that it's filled with particulars. The particulars that emanate throughout, if that's the right word, throughout Ezra Pound's life are just, once you start to look at them, overwhelming, which is of course why a lot of people stay away from them. But if you just look at one detail, it becomes amazing how these details follow out. When he was at Wabash College, only for one semester, he didn't even make it to the end of the first semester, he had a student there by the name of Robert Winter, a kid, who was taking to Pound. And he asked Pound, what should I do? And Pound said to him, although they called him Pounds, by the way, you can see they got his name wrong in the catalog, he said, you should go to China. If you want to make it, you should go to China. And then Pound left and went to Europe. But this guy took him seriously. Robert Winter. I didn't know about this until about, actually, 25 years ago. Robert Winter goes to China in about 1908 or 10, and he never leaves. He goes to China, he's there for the Cultural Revolution, he's there for the changes brought in the 1920s, he's there for when Mao comes in, he's all the way through there. He's in China for most of the 20th century. As an American, he learns Chinese, but he's an American. How do I become aware of this? Because of another writer by the name of H.R. Stoneback, or no, we call him Stony Stoneback, who only died last year, who's a big Hemingway person, but was also a country music singer. I was invited to go to China in 1999, so I asked my friend Stony, what was it like when you were invited to China? And he gave me all the things I needed to know, or what he thought I needed to. But then he told me what happened to him when he went to China. He said, I go to China, they say, here, you're going to give a lecture tonight, and tomorrow we're going to fly you to this city, and you're going to give a lecture over there on this subject, which he had never thought about. And then we're going to take you to Shanghai, where we have you set up to do a country music concert, because that's what he's known for. So that's what Stony does. So then Stony finds out that there is this man by the name of Robert Winter living in Beijing who has letters from Ezra Pound. So he tries to find Robert Winter. And they say to him, if you want to find Robert Winter, you got to go to the Summer Palace. And if you go to the Summer Palace, there's a big lake. Go to the other side of that lake, there's a little cottage. And when you get there, look on the lake. And if you see a man lying on his back, floating in the water, smoking a cigarette, that's Robert Winter. And that's what Stony does. And he finds him. And he keeps going back, and they have all these conversations. And Robert goes on about his life with Ezra Pound and his past and his life in China, but he doesn't show him the letters. So Stony keeps going back again and again, and he never showed him the letters, and then Stony had to leave. So Stony has written up this story. So then in 1999, I go to China, and I am the guest of a professor by the name of Guiming Wang, who is very, very kind to me, but who is ill. He did not live too much longer after that. But we had this plan, we were going around, I was going to these universities, tomorrow you're going to talk here and you're going to talk about this, so I hope you're ready. But they were very cordial. We went to the Ezra Pound Conference of China, where there were about 200 people, most of them Chinese. Most of the papers were in Chinese. They provided me a translator to inform me. It was really a wonderful experience. And Professor Wang, my friend, was doing everything. He was so cordial and attentive. And he was the secretary of the Ezra Pound Society of China, the way I'm a secretary of the Ezra Pound International Conference. But being a secretary in China is a lot different than being a secretary in the West. I take notes. He runs the show. And we went to this conference. I gave a paper, other people we did this, and he couldn't accompany me back to Beijing, which is about a 2-hour train ride on a very fast train. So he says to a younger associate professor, assistant professor, you take him back. You have to take him back. And this guy did not want to take me back anywhere. He was frowning and growling, and the last thing he wanted to do was have to take care of some American guy who was just getting in his way. But he was a professor, so he had to do what his elder professor said. So we go to the train station in this town of Xi'an. It's not a town, it's a city. It's a really sort of amazing place to see. The skyscrapers are just something else. And we get to this big train station in a taxi. I have my luggage. It's pouring rain. And we have to go about 2 blocks through a downpour to get to the train station. He says, that's where we're going to go. He gets out of the car and runs. And I'm going like this after him, getting soaking wet. I finally get over to the train station. He says, now we got to go get tickets. He goes and buys his ticket. Then he's waiting for me to get my ticket. If you have been to China, you know that this can be an arduous task because nobody can understand you and you can't understand them. And you have to try to figure that out. I figured it out. I got my ticket, but it took me so long, we missed our train. So this made this professor, whose name I don't unfortunately remember, even less patient with me, to put it mildly. So he says, we missed the train. We're going to have to take the next one. I want to get something to eat. I said, okay, we'll go get something to eat. I want to go to McDonald's. So we go to McDonald's. He gets his food, sits down, and then I have to sort of figure out what I'm going to do. Then we're sitting there and talking. And somehow in the conversation, it comes up. Robert Winter. And he looks at me and says, you know Robert Winter? I said, I don't know him, but I know about him. I know the story about him. He said, I've been pursuing Robert Winter for the last 10 years to understand. I want to write a book about Robert Winter. I've gone to Crawfordsville to try to research him. And suddenly, we are the best friends. He took me to his home. I met his wife. I mean, he couldn't be nicer to me because we made a connection. And we made that very specific connection from Pound to Stony Stoneback, or Pound to Rinter, because Pound said something to an undergraduate in Crawfordsville in 1907. I ended up making a friend in China in, 2012. You know, this to me is the story Ezra Pound teaches us, really. This is how we live in a world that we are connected to culturally through this kind of understanding. I hope I didn't take too long on that story. When he left Crawfordsville, Pound ended up going to Venice. He did try to get married first, by the way. He proposed to a woman by the name of Mary Moore, not the poet Mary Ann Moore, but a woman who lived in Trenton, New Jersey, named Mary Moore, and guess what? She turned him down. So he took the money he had from Crawfordsville, because even though they fired him, he was under a contract, so they paid him the rest of his salary for the year. Wish they'd do that for me. They could fire me and pay me the rest of my salary, and I'd get a year off. And he took that money and he went back to Europe, where he'd only been, I guess, twice before, maybe 3 times before, headed to Venice. And he had adventures on this, lots of stories too. I didn't talk about 1906. And he ends up in Venice, where he's living there. He lives there for about 5 months, and he tries all these different ways to stay there. But one of the places where he lives is at this San Trovaso church, the one on the left. is it's a little campo, a little square with two canals. One is called the Ognissanti Canal, and the other one is the San Trovaso Canal. So it's like a little crossroads. You can see the crossroads off to the left. And on the corner is a gondola repair factory. And there's a building on the right side that you don't see in the photograph. What happened while he was there, he was living in different places. He met these two women from the United States, one of whom was a Norton. Her father was Charles Eliot Norton, after whom there are a series of lectures at Harvard that are given now in his name. And they were a little bit older than he, so he traveled around with them in Venice. They toured things. He tried to get different jobs. He got a job as a gondolier and lasted all of one day before he realized he didn't have the muscle power to do it. They decided midsummer that they were finished in Venice, that they wanted to leave. But they had paid for the whole month of August. So they said to Ezra, who was having trouble making one day meet the next, you can stay in our place for the next month. And this was a wonderful opportunity for him. He was very unhappy in Venice, even at the same time as he was ecstatic. Sounds like somebody who is about 21 years old. He'd already lost his only job he ever got, and he was in Venice by himself, trying to make ends meet, and he had a place to live for free. And he wrote a book of poems while he was there. And he had poems with him that he brought. And there's a place just up the street from that place where he writes about 35 years later how he took his poems when he was going to get them published in Venice. And he went to the Grand Canal and he was going to throw the whole lot of them into the canal. Like, I don't need this. This is a mistake. He was trying to decide, do I want to be a scholar or do I want to be a poet? And for him, this was a conflict. To be a poet, you have a certain kind of freedom. To be a scholar, you have a certain kind of respectability. And he was fighting those two. I think we can agree, I think Bob and I agree, he's both. He becomes both. One of the distinctions about his poetry is that he's a great scholar. He's a great scholar, which is why there is a city full of scholars that have followed after him to try to come to terms with his scholarship. It's always scandalous, but it's always engaging and almost always rewarding because he takes you places. I never read a book he recommended that I didn't like because he has an instinct for finding books. So that happens in Venice. Then he does publish this book. He doesn't throw it away, called E Lume Spento. And then he goes to London. Well, I wanted to read this poem. Am I really killing the time here? Talk a little bit more. I can see what time it is. I'll read this poem. Since it's in my title, I wanted to read this poem. Don't need to talk about it. It's called An Immortality. This is the one side of Ezra Pound I think it's important to remember. This is the first poem of Ezra Pound's that I ever read. My mother had an anthology of poetry, I think Louis Untermeyer had edited, and I sort of wandered into it, and I found this poem, and I thought, yeah, this is for me. Sing we for love and idleness, naught else is worth the having. Though I have been in many a land, there is naught else in living. And I would rather have my sweet, though rose leaves die of grieving, than do high deeds in Hungary to pass all men's believing. I think when I was a lazy boy and I read that, I thought, yeah, I want the life where you don't do anything. I'll stand still and become a tree. That's good enough for me, right? Don't have to do anything else. This is another one of the paintings by Pound's friend Italico Bras, who is Venetian. This is of Florian's Cafe. If you've been to Venice, you probably have been to this place or decided not to go because it was too expensive, but it's on the St. Mark's Square. And it's a really wonderful place to sit and listen to the battling orchestras out in the piazza. This is just a photo of Pound that's not seen too often, but he's around. You can see he looks like a kid in almost any period since then, with his kind of faux coolness, you know. Then he goes to London, and we've heard a little bit about this too. This is the Yeats, the guy who says,
he's always hurting people's feelings.
He's always hurting people's feelings, right. But Yeats also did a lecture tour around the same time, just to take issue with, but not really take issue, just the other side. He did a speaking tour of the United States, and Yeats was very well known and highly respected throughout Europe. He won the Nobel Prize, and he went to Chicago, and he gave a talk to people in Chicago, and spent most of the talk talking about a poem by Ezra Pound. And one of the most interesting things about Yeats is the fact that though he was 20 years older than Ezra Pound, he and Pound became close friends. And if you've had a younger friend or an older friend, you know how that's weird, right? If you were Yeats and some guy that looked like that Pound came up to you and started talking to you, okay, that's nice. I've had a lot of students, so it's interesting to hear them go on about all this stuff they're going to do and everything. But Yeats could see it. He could see it. Even though he could see the problems, which was also smart, he hired Pound to be his secretary for 3 years in a row to go in the wintertime to a little cottage outside of London where they worked together on Yeats's works. But what really happened is Pound worked on his stuff and Yeats worked on his stuff under Pound's influence. And Yeats, who was a great 19th century poet, became in some ways the greatest 20th century poet because of Ezra Pound. Because Pound reformed and renovated his work. He made it new, and the great poems from Yeats in the late part of his life are a lot because of Pound. So much so that this is in 1912 and 1913. Pound, when he moved to Italy in 1924 that we heard, and settled in the town of Rapallo, eventually became where Yeats went. Yeats moved to Rapallo because Pound was there, and he was quite a bit older, and he wanted to be with his close friend. And Yeats died in 1939, before a lot of what we've been talking about with Pound really became very evident to the rest of the world. But they were very close. They were very close. And it's a remarkable thing to me that someone who is such a great poet and 20 years older was able to benefit from a younger poet who could do the same in response. That age difference did not really make a big difference to them. It energized their friendship rather than became something in between. Pound lived at first in London in the place on the left. He also met this philosopher by the name of T.E. Hume, who was also partly a poet, who was one of those who died in World War I. That was a great loss. A man who you probably would have heard of if he had not been killed on the Western Front. At the same time, he was also studying a medieval troubadour by the name of Bertrand de Born. And de Born were the poems that he was translating into a kind of modern English that was getting him into a lot of trouble. You have the poem Sestina Alta Fort in your handout. I'm not going to read that poem. It's a bombastic poem. There's a story about Pound being in a restaurant with his buddies. He gets up on the table in the restaurant and starts to recite Sestina Alta Fort, which the first line is, "Damn it all, Papiol, this our South stinks piece." And he takes a medieval verse form, which is very intricate from Old French, with a very intricate series of lines and echoes. And he said he goes to the British Museum to learn how to do this form, which is sort of out of fashion. He brings it back, and he writes a poem that's basically a pro-war poem. And the next day, after it was published, Pound became notorious in London because of Bertrand de Born. He took de Born's poem, he made it into a modern language. People were amazed and they were struck, and they had mixed feelings about it. And Pound says, well, I became famous after writing that poem, but you know, a poem about war could never be very important. So even at that young age, he knew that what he was doing was an exercise at part. He wanted to show that he could do it to himself and to the world, but he wasn't really advocating for war. He was imitating the voice of Bertrand de Born, you know. In addition to his interest, we already talked about this in Canto 1, to his interest in the medieval troubadours in the south of France, in the work of William Butler Yeats, in the work of Robert Browning, the 19th century poet, who is famous for writing what are called dramatic monologues, poems in the voices of historical characters, not in the poet's own voice. If you ever have read a poem called Porphyria's Lover, it's an amazing poem that predates Freud by about 50 years in the voice of a man who has just murdered his mistress, and what's going through his mind about why he's justifying how he murdered his mistress. And Pound loves this way of writing poems, so he's doing the same thing. Not only with the troubadours, also with the classics. And one of his favorites is the poet Sappho. You perhaps know Sappho. If you don't know Sappho, I recommend Sappho because, if I have her book here, I can show you. You can read the complete works of Sappho. If you leave early tonight with this book, you can read, I can't find it. You can read the complete works of Sappho before I'm finished talking. Because most of her work, which was quite brilliant, was in the library at Alexandria that burned to the ground. So most of her work was lost, and it only remains in fragments and parchments and when quoted by other writers. So, but it's beautiful work. It's beautiful work, and Pound is not alone in thinking that. So here is an example where the official Greek translation of her poem from the 19th century is, "And oftentimes while our beloved wanders abroad, when she calls to mind the love of gentle Atthis, her tender breast for sure is weighed down deep with longing." That's the literal translation of the parchment on which these few lines from Sappho remained and were not destroyed by the fire. It's like a corner of a page. Pound then renders it this way. Thy soul, it's called Emiro, that's the Greek, Emiro, or O Atthis. Thy soul, grown delicate with satieties, Atthis, O Atthis, I long for thy lips, I long for thy narrow breasts. Thou restless, ungathered. You have a poem in your handout called Gongola, which I won't refer you to because it's only 4 words. It's 3 little words. And it says like it's just the corner. Spring, too long, Gongola. It evokes Gongola. We can imagine what this poem has said. We only get those words. But in Pound's rendition, it all comes to life. Very small, very small. In addition to the troubadours, to the Greek, to the Old English, all these things that Pound is studying, he invents 3 movements in 2 years in London before he's reached the age of 30. The first one is the Imagists. In my world of poetry writing, every student knows about Imagism. If Ezra Pound had died in 1913, he would be famous because of Imagism, which transformed American poetry after that, because of the 3 things he thought poems should have that revolutionized the way people thought about poetry in the 1920s. And they still think it's revolutionary. It's over 100 years later. It's not really so revolutionary anymore. But he was sitting, he was with H.D., who had come to London. That is Hilda Doolittle, excuse me. Her name was Hilda Doolittle. And she met a young man by the name of Richard Aldington in the corner, who was a British student at the University of London. And they were all studying, not in school, well, Aldington was, but they were studying on their own at the British Museum, which is an incredible place to go and study, because it has all this stuff that's maybe been stolen from all these people all around the world, which is, again, another whole question about what do you make of the British Museum? You can't not go take advantage of it, but in doing so, it makes you one of the worst imperialists there can be, because it's all stolen from countries that were invaded by the English. H.D. was writing these poems in imitation of Sappho. Pound sent them to a brand new journal in Chicago called Poetry Magazine. The editor's Harriet Monroe. And he says, here are some poems coming from Europe, because, you know, she's in Chicago. And you should read these poems. They're marvelous. And she reads them, and she sends them back and says, they don't look like poems. They're just words. What are you saying? You know, we don't need poems like that. Because she wanted to publish traditional rhymed poems with meter and about nature or whatever. And she's writing like these fragments in Sappho, which Harriet Monroe didn't know about. So Pound is sitting in a tea shop outside of the British Museum on a certain day, which he remembers, and which Aldington and H.D. remember differently, which is they all have different stories, but because Pound is being Pound. And he takes a poem, this poem called Hermes of the Ways. The part of the title got knocked off because this is how it appeared in Poetry Magazine. He edits her poem on the page. He takes some lines out, cuts this, cuts that. And then at the bottom of the page, he signs it H.D., not Hilda Doolittle, H.D. And then after that, Imagiste. There's a whole story about that. It comes from the French surrealist poets and so on. Not surrealists. The symbolists, thank you. The symbolists poets in Paris who were working, which Pound and T.S. Eliot learned about, and it influenced their thinking. And that's all backstory. But in this moment, he writes this, he edits the poem, he signs it H.D., Imagiste. He sends them to Harriet Monroe. He says, this is part of a whole new movement of poetry that you haven't heard about. Of course, nobody's heard about it because it didn't exist until he invented it. And she said, oh, okay. And she published the poems. And Poetry Magazine then published the poem by T.S. Eliot called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, one of the most famous poems of the 20th century, in, I think it was their second or third issue. And before they reached their 100th anniversary, that magazine got a grant of $100 million, which for a poetry journal is unheard of. If you get $15, you think you're doing well, let alone $1 million. But $100 million? And so much of it is because of those early issues to which Ezra Pound contributed. He published poems there, but he contributed as an editor. He sent her poems by poets who were Americans living in Europe doing very important work, and she knew well enough to publish them. And the magazine rested on that reputation still today. And H.D., double-sided story, H.D. became not Hilda Doolittle, but H.D. And she, for the rest, she published that book, Sea Garden, with a lot of the poems of this sort, this Imagist poetry. She's the best of the Imagist poets. There's no question about it. The first and the best. She knows how to write that way beautifully. And when she was 15 years later, trying to do different kinds of things, partly she was shackled by the fact that she was so famous as H.D. in the literary circles that she couldn't break out of it. You know this story. Somebody makes a movie when they're 22 years old, and it's a famous movie. The rest of their life, they're always James Bond or whatever it is. You know, they can't get off that thing. This happens to her, and she has a lifetime's worth of work. And it wasn't really till the 1970s and 80s when feminist scholars started to say, let's look at H.D. She took on the name. She accepted it. But she was always, at least for people like me when I first read her, like, oh, she's just the Imagist poet. But she did all this novels, she was in movies, she did all kinds of stuff. And now a lot of that stuff is out, that H.D. stuff is out. But Pound really made this for her. In fact, she was taken up by this poet, Amy Lowell of Massachusetts. Wonderful stories about her. And she took H.D. under her wing and made her famous. Pound made her H.D., but actually Amy Lowell made her famous because she published her in a lot of anthologies at the time. And when Pound and some of his friends got disenchanted by what happened with Imagism, they started to call it Amygism. They felt like she had taken it over and made it something a little bit different than what they wanted. So they left that, he left that behind. This is his Imagist poem, probably the most famous poem by Ezra Pound, The Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And you can find probably more written about this poem, not just by Ezra Pound, but by almost any 20th century poet. Everybody writes about this poem and about some of the short poems of William Carlos Williams, how much they transformed the way people think about poetry in our time. Here's Pound with a group of other young poets and older poets celebrating this elder poet by the name of Wilfred Brunt at his birthday party in 1914. I think you can pick out Pound pretty easily. He's himself. At the same time, he meets Dorothy Shakespeare, who is the daughter of a woman by the name of Olivia Shakespeare, not related to the Shakespeares, but Olivia Shakespeare is one of these people who had salons in her house where artists and painters and musicians, people would gather in the evenings and they would have conversation. And it was a place where certain people of means would show parties for people who had no means. And so the poets and the poor poets and the artists would come there and eat up all the food and drink whatever they could drink and take advantage of it and say often nasty things about the very people who were taking care of them. And Pound went to those things in order to meet Yeats. And he went to, I don't know if it was Olivia Shakespeare, Dorothy's mother, but she was very good friends and kind of involved with Yeats. And then she was interested in Pound. Olivia was. But also her daughter, Dorothy, was there. And Pound was more interested in Dorothy than he was interested in her mother. But they were still all part of this cultural vitality going on in London. And they got married. He married her in 1914, on 18th of April in 1914 in Kensington, London. And there are pictures of where they lived together, 5 Holland Place Chambers, and where Pound had lived before that. You can do a lot of visiting in London to see things related to Pound and to T.S. Eliot. Eliot was another figure who came into Pound's life, often considered the most important poet of the 20th century, despite Yeats, despite Pound. T.S. Eliot is greatly revered, and he's the author of probably the most famous poem of the 20th century, which is The Wasteland, considered to be a revolutionary poem. But what we know now quite well is that poem was heavily edited by Ezra Pound. So much so that Eliot dedicated the poem to Pound and said, to Ezra Pound, il miglior fabbro, to the better maker. Because Pound knew how to take what Eliot was doing and make it sing. And Eliot knew that for the rest of his life. When Pound was in the institution, when he was getting charged, Eliot always remembered what Pound had done for him. Eliot won the Nobel Prize while Pound was in the asylum. But Eliot was part of those who tried to work on Pound's behalf through the 1950s because he knew what Pound had done. It's a long and fascinating story. There's also, which Florence mentioned last night, Blast, this movement called Vorticism, which Pound was involved. So we've heard some about that. This is the journal that was referred to last night that came out in 1914. It came out in June of 1914, not long before the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That was the spark that started the First World War. So again, Bob talked about last night how everything changed once that war started, and the promise of these figures. Incredible. There's some wonderful stories about what happened. H.D. claimed that her miscarriage from her first pregnancy was the result of the sinking of the Lusitania, because she was so distressed by what had happened and the end of her opportunities that she had to miss it. She had a child later. She named the child Perdita. Perdita means lost one. She named her child Lost One in 1919. Wyndham Lewis is the other figure that's big on this. Here's the painting of the Vorticists together. I think you can figure out which one is Pound. on the left. Pound was still, he was like 20, in his 20s, and he was being satirized in the British press. They referred to him as Ezekiel Ton. And the other one was Isaiah Ounce. And they went after him. And there was one writer by the name of Lascelles Abercrombie. And Lascelles Abercrombie wrote something in the press that Pound found so troubling, to put it mildly, that he wrote, "Stupidity carried beyond a certain point becomes a public menace." So his review of Lascelles Abercrombie, a poet, very respectable poet, for what he was publishing, was he said he had to call him on it. So he challenged him to a duel. This American guy from Haley comes and, I mean, that's the cowboy thing, right? Except it's European style. And we've had conversations about this before, you know. He challenges him to a duel because of his poetry being so bad. And Abercrombie, being a gentleman, has to respond to this. And he remembers something, to his credit. Abercrombie says, well, when you're challenged to a duel, you have to respond. But the one who is challenged gets to choose the weapon. So he says, I will duel with you, and the weapons shall be copies of our unsold books of poems. And he knew that Pound had a whole lot more copies of unsold books, a much bigger arsenal than Abercrombie. So Pound called it off. They didn't have the duel. But this is the kind of world that he's involved in. It's very imaginative and memorable and distinctive, but it's really the world of culture that Pound is really steeped in his getting involved in every aspect of poetry. This is his friend Henri Gaudier-Bresca, also mentioned earlier, the sculptor, also killed in the trenches in World War I, probably the most profound loss that Pound felt from those that he rails about in the cantos and in Moberly, which you read from, you know, the botched civilization, you know, this promising generation which is sent by the older people who run the country to their deaths, to their mindless deaths. And if you know the statistics from the Battle of Verdun, you know what he's talking about. You know, hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides of the war dying over a weekend for 5 feet of land that they don't keep getting. You know, those images of people, okay, 19th century, march into the field, okay, mow them down with the machine guns, and nobody survives. And then the next rank, and the soldiers all knew they were headed to this death. And Henri Bresca is writing from the front back to Pound, and Pound is trying to get his sculpture preserved and on model and sold because he's trying to look out for Gaudier-Bresca's well-being while he's away at war. And then he finds out that there's a letter that he got from him like a few days before Gaudier-Bresca died. And this is what kind of work, that, including this head of Pound, that's a very famous one, and there's also a sculpted head that Bresca did. He did an amazing amount of work for a man who died when he was about 22 years old. I mean, he was real young. He was younger than Pound. Here's another poem, and I don't know if I should quit or not, but I'll read this poem, and then I'll just say a few more things. I'll show you a couple more pictures. This is a kind of a Vorticist poem called The Rest That You Have. I wanted to read this poem because it does bring us home again. O helpless few in my country, O remnant enslaved, artists broken against her, astray, lost in the villages, mistrusted, spoken against, lovers of beauty, starved, thwarted with systems, helpless against the control, you who cannot wear yourselves out by persisting to excesses, you who can only speak, who cannot steel yourselves into reiteration, you of the finer sense, broken against false knowledge, you who can know at first hand, hated, shut in, mistrusted, take thought. I have weathered the storm. I have beaten out my exile. And if you go to the Ezra Pound house in Haley and you see the plaque on the door, Ezra Pound was born in this house, the line underneath it is, I have beaten out my exile. So that brings us back to Haley, that line. I could talk about the way that Pound worked with Chinese. We've talked about that before, and how he lucked into these texts of Chinese. I'll just go through the pictures here from this man, Ernest Fenollosa, and he saved Fenollosa's manuscripts after Fenollosa died because of the woman on the right, his wife, who asked Ezra Pound when she read his work, will you take care of my husband's legacy because you're the right person for the job? And Pound devoted himself to that task for the rest of his life. When he was translating Confucius while he was in the asylum, he was still thinking about Fenollosa. This is one of the poems that I won't read, which is one of the poems that he translates from this poet Li Bai from the Tang Dynasty in China. Then I'm skipping World War I. And we go to Paris. You can see Pound here with the artists in Paris in the 20s. The woman at the bottom, in the middle, is Mina Loy. Pound wrote a review of her book in 1919, but it really wasn't until the 1980s that Mina Loy was rediscovered as one of the important poets of the 20th century. But Pound was writing on her behalf in 1919 when she published her first book. Her books were not available until they were republished by MIT Press in the 1980s. She's also in the picture on the left. Here are some figures that you may know. Another local guy, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, who is one of the people who did not like Pound. So you can quote Yeats, like, people don't like him. She did not like him because they were rivals. This is I wanted to skip to. This is a book published in the 1960s called Ezra Pound in Italy. And if you'll forgive me to tell one more story, then I'll quit, I promise. This man on the right, Vittorugo Contino, born in 1925, recently died, was a cameraman. If you, I didn't know this till recently, but he was a cameraman on movies like Ben-Hur and Helen of Troy in the 1950s as a young cameraman. Then in the 1960s, he was also worked as a photographer. He was assigned, he'd worked with also the Portuguese filmmaker Ponte Corvo, if you know Ponte Corvo. He worked on the film Battle of Algiers. But in the 1960s, he was assigned to go to this place called Vietnam and take pictures of the war going on there before the US really escalated the war, but it was right on the verge of that in the mid-1960s. I didn't know any of this. I was at a reading for poems for Ezra Pound by poets writing in English and poets writing in Italian in Rome, maybe about 10 years ago. And in the audience was Vittorugo Contino. And he comes up to me and starts to talk to me. And he says, you know, speaking his English is not real strong, but he said, in the 1960s, I was assigned to go and take photographs of the war in Vietnam after doing these other things. And I didn't know about the other things. He said, I was taking photographs. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The carnage and the death, the bodies, how the war worked. I took my pictures, I did what they asked me to do, and when I got back to Italy, I decided I'm never going to take pictures again. He was broken by what human beings do to each other, and he was going to quit. This other guy, Gianfranco Ivancic, also very interesting figure, very interesting, friend of Hemingway's when he was in Cuba, from Venice. Decided to put a book together called Spots and Dots. By this time, Pound was out of the asylum, back in Italy in the 1960s, 1967. And Ivancic, close friend of Hemingway's, who was dead at that point, convinced Pound to go on a trip with him through Italy to sites in Italy, starting in Venice, that are sites that Pound has written about in the cantos. And Pound agrees to do this at this age. So they go, you can go to the sites in Venice and you can use this book. It's still around. It's not very many copies left. I'd like to bring it back into print. And Pound is standing there next to things that he was writing about in the cantos in the 40s and the 20s and 30s all the way through. But they want photographs. So he asks Vittorugo Contino to join them on this trip to be the photographer for this book, Spots and Dots, Ezra Pound in Italy, the Pisan cantos. Contino tells me, so I agreed to do this, even though I was not going to take pictures anymore. And he said, after I spent that time with Ezra Pound, I was transformed. My life came back to me. He said, I owe my life to Pound because of who he was and how we got on during that trip. And he said, I owe everything since that time to his bringing me back, as it were, from the dead, as a poet, to this world. And I asked him to take pictures of the reading, and they weren't very good. But that wasn't his fault, it was my camera. But I was so moved by this that he found out that we were having this reading, and he came there to hear poets read in honor of Ezra Pound, each of whom has their own story about how Pound has influenced them. And he just came to hear the poems because of his devotion. What is that? 40 years later, still thinking about what Pound meant to him. This is another one of these stories of which I've been lucky to hear many in sort of by chance, of people who, in one way or another, found a personal or specific connection. And one of the ways to read his epic poem is to look for the line that belongs to you, because it's probably in there. I know you think that's crazy, but it happens. I'm talking at the castle where Pound's daughter lives, and this guy comes up and says, I want to learn about Pound because you know my grandfather was a college roommate of his at Hamilton College. I say, really? He says, yes, and we look it up. Sure enough, there it is. All the way. Pound, as an epic poet, does what an epic poet can do. Touch the lives and be touched by the lives of individuals one at a time and bring them together into a work containing history. So I'll stop there, and forgive me for my verbosity. I really appreciate the chance. Thank you. Thank you.
That was an extraordinary presentation. Thank you very, very much.
No, thank you.
Would you be willing to stay around a little bit in case anyone has some questions?
No, I'm not interested anymore. I'm out of here. No, of course.
And of course, we have our other presenters too, Bob and Ted, if you have any questions you'd like to raise to them as well. Tony, what? Okay, you're just stretching your arm. Okay.
I thought it was a Q&A.
Just given the time, we'll break, but John will stick around and take questions. So, yeah. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. If you get a chance, please fill out that short survey.
Thank you.
And again, thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you very much for this series. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.